As you guys know, the main topic for today is Space, the L2 launched by Coinbase, and more specifically, the ecosystem that they've launched, like the application that they've managed to attract. Before diving into that, we'll talk about Ethereum layer 2s in general, how they are set up, and specifically how Base is set up on top of the OP stack. Then we'll talk about the ecosystem itself. Firstly, from a more broad perspective, looking at the key metrics and their growth, and then more specifically on the ecosystem players. So we'll do a nice map of all the, well, not all, but many of the key players in the ecosystem and differentiating factors. And finally, some based opportunities. Excuse me for the mediocre pun there, but we'll talk some of the longer term opportunities that can arise from the ecosystem. Before we do, though, quick update about Into the Block. We've been working significantly, a significant amount of time on this new release we're calling Perspectives. They're comparative dashboards showing very different points of view into the market. The idea is to have some of the key points, not just from a broad perspective, but also in a more agile, recurrent basis, so that you can expect perspective dashboards on some of the key trends at the moment. We're very excited about this release and hope to launch this with for our general public within the next week or two. We also made a timely update to our capital markets section. We added the bond ETFs data. It's a bit of a minor improvement, but given the historical crash that bonds have been undergoing, it's quite relevant, and I've been using some of this data in the newsletter in case you guys are interested. In macro, we keep you guys covered in that aspect as well. And finally, on the risk radar, our third product that we have currently on an alpha phase, we launched Moonwell, which is a lending protocol on Base. We already supported it on Moonbeam. We added 10 more indicators, and now we also support this on Base, which is one of the ecosystem projects that we'll discuss briefly. All right, now let's dive into layer 2s and how they work. So just so everyone's on the same page, people when usually speak of chains, they talk about a layer 1. So Ethereum mainnet being the first smart contract platform. It has a lot of applications built on top of it, but as it became clear that it essentially wasn't able to scale, it opted for a more modular approach where layers are built on top of it. So each of these layer 2s have their own consensus engines that they call the sequencer, that they process transactions, they batch those, they validate them, and then they send those to the layer 1, like proof of them, to the parent chain, in this case, Ethereum mainnet. The sequencer, hence, is a bit of a point of failure in a way, which is one of the risks, but it also allows transactions to be processed at a much larger quantity and at a fraction of the cost, which is the main benefit. And then they compress those transactions and send them to the layer 1 chain, thus leading to the final settlement of the transactions. We're going to be focusing mostly on the optimism layer 2, since it's what Base is built on top of. The optimistic virtual machine was launched, I believe, initially, in 2020, they launched the testnet. It's EVM equivalent, which essentially means it's code that you deploy on Ethereum mainnet can be just copied and pasted, essentially, in theory, into Optimism and be fully compatible. Hence the word equivalence instead of compatibility. It relies on the sequencer for the block production, as do most L2s, and this is the validator. Currently, it's just one single sequencer, and Base has its own sequencer as well, and it's operated by a multisig. So there is risks in this setup, of course, and it has a native bridging communication protocol, which is arguably more secure than some of the other bridging solutions across Ethereum to a completely different layer one. Within layer one to layer two has been more secure, and the lack of hacks also points that direction. And so Optimism made a big change this year in that they moved away from their Optimism mainnet focus onto a broader perspective. So they introduced the term superchain. So rather than focusing on multiple chains all built differently, they open sourced. It was already open source, but they now encourage and made it easier for people to develop on top of their OP stack, which is essentially the layer that they use for Optimism mainnet. It's available for anyone to fork, and it's creating a network of connected layer twos, enabling parallelism, where each layer two has their own sequencer, their own settlement, and to a degree, certain sovereignty. And eventually, they'll have a bridging communication layer between them. The main, OP stack layer two that has launched since is Base. Of course, has not been the only one. Also, Mantle launched one, Aevo launched one for derivatives, Zora for NFTs. So we're seeing a bunch of OP stack layer twos, and they all, as part of the agreement of launching this, agreed to a 15% fee redirect. So 15% of the fees processed by the sequencers of each of these chains goes to the Optimism Collective, which is like the set of governance. It used to be just for governance of the Optimism mainnet, but as they broadened the scope, the OP token now is like the governance for all of this superchain. And the fee, the idea is to use that to fund sustainably public goods and like infrastructure improvements over time. So it has that in place, and it creates that agreement between all of the parties, including Coinbase, working on the superchain. One of the key differentiators is that they're working towards having homogeneous block space, which essentially means it's compatible, it's the same across all of the chains in the superchain, making it much easier to communicate with the other, and for applications to deploy across multiple of these chains if that's what they'd like. And to govern that, they're introducing the law of chains, which is essentially like the core principles to deploy in the OP stack and to vote on improvements to the OP stack, and how those will change over time. So anyone holding OP gets to be a stakeholder in how this network of networks gets to scale. And what attracted Base to Optimism? Other than, as I mentioned, the parallelism, the scalability, and decentralization, they reached an agreement with Optimism to be financially aligned. So they have an agreement for about $140 million worth of OP tokens at current prices. It's a long-term agreement, so don't worry, they're not just dumping these tokens at market prices right now. It's a 6-year vesting of OP tokens. Part of them have been already funded retroactively, but most of the portion will be vested throughout 6 years. So longer than the standard 4-year vesting, encouraging that long-term alignment. And it's also milestone based. So Coinbase is agreeing to be devoting resources to development of the superchain, improving that core infrastructure and compatibility across chains, as well as the bridging. They're also agreeing to be an active participator in the governance of Optimism, though they're capping it. They introduced a cap to avoid having too much bias from Coinbase, essentially too much influence within the OP stack. So it's capped at just 9% of the votes. Now, let's dive into the main topic. Now that we understand how Base works, let's talk about some of the impressive numbers that it's been realizing. So Base, was being tested initially in early July, late June, but it launched officially, I believe it was the 27th of July. And since then, we see a large uptick in the number of active addresses. And as more applications deployed around August, we see a large spike, around 1 million daily active addresses, surpassing in multiple days other L2s and Ethereum mainnet as well. So it could be arguably, at least for L1s, for L2s, it's probably the fastest one to reach 1 million daily active addresses. And in across layer ones is one of the highest, regardless. In terms of comparison, this is one of the new exciting features that we're launching in the Perspectives product that I mentioned. We'll be able to compare these metrics across multiple rollups. And so let's see, you can see here ETH base on base versus optimism and arbitrum. So the main optimistic rollups. It quickly in August, as FRCH started getting some traction, the number of active addresses jumped to the highest out of all. Optimism surpassed it briefly, and now Ethereum base has settled as the largest number of active addresses, with about 50% of the active addresses share across all optimistic rollups, across the major ones, I should say. In terms of transactions, it's the leader, definitely in terms of the number of transactions. It's processing about 40% of the transactions compared to like 50% of the addresses. But in terms of volume, we see it's less dominant. So Arbitrum, by and large, is the dominant player in terms of volume. So there's more financial activity being settled in Arbitrum than in Base or Optimism. Base did spike a few days to get as much as 40%, but it has since settled closer to 25% of the broader volume. And what does this trend tell us about like the composition of the users? It hints that the average user in Base settles and moves a lot less financial capital than they do in Arbitrum. So it's tailored towards a broader retail base, which is no surprise, understanding Coinbase position as one of the largest exchanges with the highest number of retail users. And we see this reflected, of course, in the number of in the average transaction size. So in Base, we see here a bit of a spike initially in the average transaction size, but it's settled since September at a significantly lower level to the other L2s. So an average transaction over the past week of about $120 compared to $180 or $200 in the other L2s. This is, of course, an order of magnitude lower than an Ethereum mainnet, where a lot of the larger settlements continue to take place. But it's still remarkably lower, the difference between Base and Optimism and Arbitrum, showing that differentiation for the retail audience preferring Base. Now let's dive into the ecosystem applications. So since the get-go, there's been a lot of attention towards Base, and they were able to attract a lot of applications that launched within the first few weeks of Base. It's only been about 3-4 months since they launched. They have in total probably close to 300 to 500 applications. And I've segmented these by sort of sector within the crypto economy. Of course, it's not a fully representative sample of every aspect, but I try to keep the key players that represent each sector the best. So for social, the main player that has been gathering attention and a lot of users is FRCH. I'll talk about this one in a bit more depth, but it's been one of the differentiated sectors that has pushed Base to attract users significantly. In NFTs, we see a lot of the exchanges, or OpenSea, Magic Eden as well, but we also see some native projects launch like Paint on Base and Build on Block, which is like a music royalty service for media. We see Mirror and a few other related services. For DeFi, interestingly, we see a nice mix between the so-called blue chip protocols that are available across other chains and already have a good amount of traction across several chains throughout a few years already. So of course, Uniswap, Aave, Curve, a few others. But we also see a number of new protocols or like relatively smaller protocols from other chains migrate into Base. So one example of that is Aerodrome, which is a fork of Velodrome, which was the largest DEX on Optimism. They launched on Base. We also see Moonwell, as I mentioned, which was initially in Moonbeam on Polkadot, launching in Base, being one of the largest lending protocols, as well as Sone, which was before on Optimism. In terms of infrastructure and data, they have a wide range of options for analytics, for oracles, for bridging, not just of finance, but also cross-chain messaging, wallet support, validators, the graph, ledger, 100 plus companies and protocols deployed throughout the Base ecosystem. Within a few months, this is probably the largest number of applications that any ecosystem has managed to attract. So that also explains the large growth that we're seeing in the transaction numbers that I previously displayed. And so I wanted to focus a bit more on Frentech, which in a few days has had as much as 50% of all the transactions on Base. So essentially, Frentech has been a bit of a viral phenomenon within crypto circles, at least. Hasn't expanded too successfully beyond crypto circles, but within crypto users, it's been very relevant, and its revenue figures demonstrate that. So it's essentially, Frentech are like social paid groups that you can use to access given influencer. It doesn't have to be like a influencer in the common terms. It can be any person with a large audience, or even your friends, of course. Anyone can buy their keys that give you access into these channels, these groups where you're able to talk with that person and their broader community. But more importantly, what they introduced is that these keys are tradable. So you can get upside in these chat rooms, essentially, if they add value, and the creators of these chat rooms themselves also get a portion of the fees rewarded back to them. So it has a lot of financial incentives being gamified and rewarding both the creators and the speculators in this, which, as you guys may have seen, in some cases they've generated large amounts of money. Then this created a whole trend towards social fi, which, it seems like we just plug in fi to any category in crypto these days. But nonetheless, it's been quite significant. It has over 300,000 unique accounts registered, and differently from addresses, each of these accounts have validated their Twitter account. So they are arguably a better representation of what a user is than a regular address, because of course one can have 1,000 addresses. You could argue that someone can have multiple Twitter accounts, but it creates more headaches, of course, than creating multiple addresses. It's not as easy, and it's less of a pattern. So it is quite a success within just a few months to attract these many user numbers. And the more impressive part is their revenues in general. So they charge a 10% fee on every transaction, of which 5% goes to the creator and 5% goes to the Frentech protocol. And with those numbers, they gathered about 13 million revenue for Frentech, of which 26 million in total. 13 million went to Frentech, 13 million was distributed to the Frentech users, which is, in September, I believe, was the second or third largest crypto application in general, including Ethereum as number one. And I think Frentech was up there with Uniswap in terms of total fees, and of course in terms of value created to users, significantly higher than Uniswap would, than to the companies, which Uniswap doesn't have a fee sharing, as you guys know. And finally, I want to talk about some of the opportunities that have arisen within Base and that will continue over the last few months. So Coinbase took advantage of their position in the market, having a broad audience to promote their chain. They had a set of daily mints. They created a lot of social experimentation towards people using Base, promoting on-chain activity, rewarding people with NFTs for accomplishing tasks. Very small gamification, but that in general contributed to attract more users, many of which was likely their first time testing a layer 2, perhaps even on-chain in general. As I mentioned with Frentech, with the social fi movement, there's also been some organic experimentation. So part of it came from the Coinbase side, but also from the applications that saw the potential to work with or provide services to this retail audience that Coinbase has access to. So Coinbase is being already the main player, arguably, or one of the main players in this whole social fi movement and so decentralized social applications in general. And you see a lot of iteration, testing new ideas. I think they even saw like a dating show where you can bet on chain recently. So all types of, somewhat bizarre ideas, of which many may sound strange now, but over time we'll see what ends up working. So it's been a whole iterative approach towards these applications. Then we see a bit of an emphasis on payments. Of course, Coinbase, being one of the founding members of USDC, has this synergy where they can launch USDC and quickly onboard users from the Coinbase to Base, supporting USDC. It's also supported across several DeFi applications. It's the main stablecoin within DeFi. So unsurprisingly, Coinbase also benefits from this. And on the other side of it, Coinbase also is offering 5% APY on USDC in their platform. So it creates that, double-sided benefit where users can move from, like, if they want to save, they can have their 5% APY on Coinbase, or if they want to, buy some tokens or do some activity on chain, like providing liquidity or going to a lending market, they can easily move that USDC from Coinbase into the Base L2 and access the whole universe of applications. So this is a synergy that I expect to continue improving, especially if and when USDC becomes wider, more integrated across transactions. On a quick tangent, they said that they just announced that they'll be using USDC for tests on their settlements. So it seems like we're heading down that way, and Base could benefit from this broader adoption of stablecoins. Then there is public goods funding. So Optimism, since the very beginning, has had an emphasis on public goods, which they qualify as a broad set of services that people build, and these are funded retroactively. So essentially, you develop a product. If you prove that it added value to the Optimism ecosystem, this includes Optimism mainnet, but also Base, another of the layer 2s building on top of a superchain. If you build something of value here, or even created like an article explaining this, so they're encouraging educators and creators, you can get part of these rewards giving to you. So right now they announced their third round. They're distributing about $36 million in tokens across all of these applications. And more importantly, right now it's fueled, it's funded through the OP token rewards, but they're moving towards having these public good funding being recurring on a more sustainable way, where a portion of fees from Base and other L2s goes to public good funding. So it's such that it doesn't rely just on inflation of like minting of new tokens, but rather it's a more of a loop, a positive feedback loop, where ideally the Optimism ecosystem generates fees, which are then used to fund more infrastructure and development, which then creates more fees and funds that and so forth, subsidizing the growth of this sort of interconnected network state. And finally, it has less to do with optimism and Base specifically, but with L2s in general. In the first quarter of 2024, that's a mistake, not 2023, 2024, proto-dank sharding is expected to be implemented in the upcoming upgrade. It got moved from Q4 to Q1. And what this upgrade will bring is the introduction of data blobs. So essentially, they're separating the data computation from a transaction, making it more efficient for transactions in L2s to be able to settle their transactions in L1s by reducing the total amount of the size of each of these transactions significantly. And this translates into transactions being 10 to 100 times cheaper across all rollups. So this will benefit significantly Optimism, Base, Arbitrum, Polygon, everyone building a layer 2. But when it comes uniquely to Base, if you think about like what applications would benefit from lower transaction costs, I would argue, based on my research, that social applications are one of the applications where people are less likely to pay for, like, imagine sharing a post on Instagram and you get charged for posting that. Obviously, people will be posting less if that were the case. But what happens if that cost goes from being 5 cents to being 0.05 cents? So, less than a penny. This could really stimulate the social activity. And Base, as I mentioned, is kind of primed to take advantage of this, as they've already seen an inflow of developers building social applications on top of Base. And of course, there will be some applications that we can't even imagine right now that will be enabled by these scalability improvements. All right. So to conclude, Coinbase is long-term committed to Optimism, the superchain vision. It's a 6-year vesting agreement, so relatively long-term. Towards the end of the decade, we should start really seeing some of the broader mainstream adoption that they envision. Coinbase mentioned multiple times that they envision Base being the way to reach 1 billion users on chain. Of course, we're very far from that, so that aligns with their long-term vision. Base, within months, became one of the most used chains, so I would argue it's been quite successful at that. It's the #1 optimistic rollup in terms of transactions, fees, and daily active addresses currently. It's managed to do this by attracting a combination of established protocols in other layer 1s and layer 2s, and also new protocols that saw the opportunity of developing here and working with the existing users of Coinbase to enable broader reach of the on-chain economy. We've seen some pragmatic experimentation, trying new applications that may initially sound a bit out there, but we're seeing a lot of iteration towards these, and eventually, we should see more application experimentation, bring more users and adoption. This creates the opportunity, the way Base is set up and Optimism, to have continuous sustainable funding. So if you're looking to contribute to Base and Optimism in general, you can also participate in these retroactive public goods funding, which, as I mentioned, is giving about $36 million currently, and we'll have more coming rounds, fueling this growth of the ecosystem. And finally, it should also benefit, of course, from EIP 4844, which is the largest, most anticipated Ethereum upgrade coming next year. So overall, on looking at 2024, we should see broader expansion and usage across Base, across the whole on-chain economy. And hopefully this will bring less speculative action and more organic demand into crypto. Awesome. So thanks everyone for joining us. You can sign up now for the next webinar. We'll be talking about DeFi, the core focus of our institutional arm. Our CEO will be diving about the alpha and DeFi, exploring some of the opportunities and challenges in the current state of DeFi. So with that out of the way, make sure to sign up. We shared the link in the chat, and I'll be sticking around for some questions now.